The sun was a hammer, and the Texas sky was its anvil. From the moment it cracked the horizon, a flat, searing white line in the east, it beat down on the Thornfield farm with the fury of a forgotten god. The air didn't move. It hung thick and heavy, shimmering in waves above the hard-packed dirt, tasting of dust and the faint metallic scent of coming drought. For Magnolia Thornfield, the heat was a second skin, a constant suffocating companion that clung to her from the pre-dawn chill to the breathless dark. At 16, she felt 100 years old, her youth baked out of her bones filled not with marrow but with the fine, gritty soil she worked from sunup to sundown. Every morning began the same. The sharp rap on her door, her father's voice a splinter of wood in the quiet. Up. Work don't do itself. No. Good morning. No kindness. Kindness had died with her mother. This morning the task was clearing the south parcel, a stubborn patch of earth choked with mesquite and stubborn rock-like clods of clay. It was man's work, but there were no other men. There was only Jeremiah, her father, and her, and Buster. Buster the mule was older than Magnolia, a fixture of the farm as permanent as the failing well or the skeletal frame of the windmill that hadn't turned in a year. He was a creature of profound silence and deep, liquid brown eyes that seemed to hold the sorrow of every season he'd witnessed. His coat was the color of dust, his ears long and expressive, and his loyalty absolute. He stood hitched to the small wooden plow, his head low, patiently bearing the sun's assault. He was, Magnolia often thought, the only other living thing on this farm that understood the language of endurance. Magnolia's hands, raw and blistered despite the calluses, gripped the splintered handles of the plow. The leather reins were looped over her shoulders, digging into the thin fabric of her cotton dress. Sweat traced clean paths through the grime on her face, stinging the perpetual sunburn on her cheeks and the back of her neck. Each step was a battle. The plow would catch on a root or a rock, jarring her entire body, sending a shockwave of pain up her arms and into her aching back. Her father stood a dozen yards away, under the pathetic shade of a lone, half-dead oak tree, a rifle propped against its trunk. He wasn't working. He was watching. His presence was a weight heavier than the sun, a pressure in the air that made it even harder to breathe. Jeremiah Thornfield was a man hollowed out by grief and filled back up with rage. When her mother, Elara, was alive, he had been a man of quiet smiles and strong, gentle hands that could fix anything from a broken fence to a child's broken heart. But the fever that took Elara 2 years ago had burned away that man, leaving this cruel caricature in his place. His face, once handsome and open, was now a mask of grim lines, his eyes narrowed to permanent slits against the sun and the world. He believed work was the only cure for sorrow, a penance for the sin of still being alive when his wife was not. And he inflicted this cure on his daughter with a zealot's fervor. "Put your back into it, girl," he barked, his voice grating across the oppressive silence. "You're moving slower than molasses in winter." Magnolia gritted her teeth, biting back the retort that wanted to leap from her throat. Words were useless. They only earned her his belt. She leaned forward, pushing her entire meager weight into the plow. The muscles in her legs screamed. A sharp, bright pain flared behind her eyes, and the world swam for a moment, the horizon tilting crazily. She could feel Buster straining with her, his powerful haunches bunched, his hooves digging for purchase in the unforgiving ground. The mule never complained, never balked unless the work was truly impossible. He was a better partner than her father had ever been. She murmured to him, her voice a dry rasp. "Easy, Buster. Just a little more." The mule's ears twitched back, acknowledging her. Her father had taken to carrying a length of thick leather strap, looped through his belt. He called it a motivator. 2 days ago, when she'd stumbled, spilling a bucket of precious water, he had used it on her back. The welts still burned beneath her dress, a private map of his cruelty. Now, he unhooked it, slapping it rhythmically against his thigh. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was a snake's rattle, a promise of violence that made the air crackle. "I ain't paying you to whisper sweet nothings to that dumb animal," Jeremiah yelled. "I'm telling you to work." The dizziness returned, stronger this time. The edges of her vision began to darken, fringed with glittering black specks. The sun on the back of her neck was a physical blow. Her lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand. She knew the signs. She was falling behind the body's demands, running on a deficit of water and food and sleep that was finally catching up to her. She tried to take another step, to appease the monster under the tree, but her legs refused. They felt disconnected, like stilts made of jelly. The world began to spiral, the brown earth and the white sky swirling into a meaningless blur. The thwack, thwack, thwack of the strap grew louder, closer. "I said move!" The last thing she felt was the rough caress of the plow handle slipping from her grasp. The last thing she heard was her own small, defeated gasp as her strength gave out completely. Her knees buckled. There was no grace in the fall, no attempt to catch herself. She simply folded, collapsing forward, her face hitting the hard-packed Texas dirt with a soft, final thud. The earth was hot against her cheek, but it was also solid. It was real. For a moment, there was only the taste of dust in her mouth and the blessed, silent darkness that rushed in to claim her. The oppressive hopelessness, the physical and emotional exhaustion had won. She was a victim, a broken thing lying in the dirt, and in that moment of surrender, there was a strange, terrifying peace. The world swam back into focus, not with a sound, but with a shadow. Her father's boots stood inches from her face, caked in the same dust that now coated her tongue. He loomed over her, a dark silhouette against the blinding sun. The rhythmic slapping of the leather strap had stopped. She braced herself for the sting, for the searing pain that would follow. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body curling into itself, a reflexive, primal defense. "Get up." Jeremiah's voice was low, laced with a contempt that was somehow worse than his yelling. "There ain't no room for weakness here. You get up or I'll drag you up." She tried. She willed her arms to push, her legs to tense, but her body was a traitor. It lay limp and unresponsive, a sack of weary bones. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye, carving a muddy track through the dust on her temple. It was the tear of absolute despair. She had nothing left. And then, something shifted. It was a change in the quality of the silence. The ever-present buzz of insects seemed to cease. The air grew still, charged with a new and unfamiliar tension. From the ground, Magnolia heard a sound she had never heard before from Buster. It wasn't a bray or a snort. It was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up from the very earth itself. It was a sound of deep, ancient anger. "What in the hell?" Jeremiah muttered, turning his head. Magnolia forced her own head to turn, her cheek scraping against the gritty dirt. What she saw defied all logic, all experience. Buster, the placid, patient mule, had transformed. His head was high, his ears pinned back flat against his skull. His lips were peeled back from his large yellow teeth in a silent, terrifying snarl. The placid brown eyes were now burning with a cold, intelligent fire. He had taken 2 steps forward, lowering his head like a bull, his gaze fixed not on the horizon, not on the plow, but squarely on Jeremiah Thornfield. Jeremiah laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Well, I'll be. The jackass has got some spirit after all." He raised the leather strap. "Nothing a good cut won't fix. You'll learn your place, same as her." He took a step toward the mule, the strap held high. Buster didn't move. He just watched, his powerful body coiled like a spring. As Jeremiah swung his arm, the strap whistling through the hot air, Buster exploded into motion. It wasn't a panicked bolt. It was a charge, precise and deliberate. He lunged forward, not with his teeth, but with his head, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for an animal of his size and age. He didn't aim for Jeremiah's body. He aimed for his hand. With a sharp, upward jerk of his powerful neck, Buster's head connected with Jeremiah's wrist. The sound was a sickening crack, followed by Jeremiah's howl of pain and surprise. The leather strap flew from his grasp, tumbling through the air and landing in the dust near Magnolia's head. Jeremiah stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. "You son of a bitch!" he roared, his voice cracking. "You broke my wrist, you goddamn animal!" But Buster wasn't finished. He took another deliberate step, placing his heavy body between Jeremiah and the collapsed form of Magnolia. He was a wall of dusty fur and furious muscle, a silent guardian. He lowered his head again, the rumbling in his chest starting once more, a clear and unmistakable warning. Jeremiah, blinded by pain and rage, scrambled with his good hand for the rifle propped against the oak tree. "I'll kill you. I'll shoot you where you stand." He fumbled with the weapon, his face contorted. He finally got it shouldered, leveraging it awkwardly with his injured arm, and aimed it at the mule's broad head. Magnolia's heart seized. "No!" The word was a choked whisper, lost in the vast, hot silence. She couldn't lose Buster. He was all she had left. As Jeremiah's finger tightened on the trigger, Buster did the second impossible thing. He charged again, not with the blind fury of a cornered animal, but with a terrifying strategic purpose. He drove forward, lowering his head at the last second and sweeping it sideways. The solid bone of the mule's skull slammed into the rifle's stock. The weapon was knocked from Jeremiah's grip, spinning away and clattering uselessly onto the rocks 10 feet away. The tableau held for a long, breathless moment. The disarmed and injured man, the defiant mule standing sentinel, and the girl in the dust watching it all unfold with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The oppressive atmosphere of the farm had not just been disturbed, it had been shattered. The unwritten laws of power and submission, of father and daughter, of man and beast, had been violently rewritten. Seeing Buster, her Buster, the gentle, plodding soul, rise up with such righteous, intelligent fury, did something to the girl on the ground. It was like a lightning strike to a dead tree, jolting something deep inside her back to life. It wasn't just shock, it was a spark, a tiny, fragile ember of defiance kindling in the cold ashes of her hopelessness. For 2 years, she had endured. She had bent and bent and bent, believing she was too weak to do anything but. But Buster hadn't bent. He had pushed back. He had, with an act of impossible courage, said no. A strange new strength flowed into her limbs. It wasn't physical. She was still weak, still dizzy. It was a different kind of power, a current of resolve that came from witnessing an injustice met with resistance. Her protector was a mule who had seen enough, and if a mule could find the strength to fight back, then so could she. Slowly, painfully, Magnolia Thornfield began to push herself up from the Texas dirt. The dust felt different as she rose. It was no longer the bed of her defeat, but a launching point. Her arms, which had failed her minutes ago, now trembled with a fierce, newfound purpose. She got to her knees, her head still swimming, the world a dizzying smear of brown and white. Her gaze was locked on Buster. The mule stood his ground, a living shield between her and her father. He hadn't moved. His ears were still back, his body tense, but his low growl had subsided. He watched Jeremiah, but Magnolia felt somehow that his awareness was entirely focused on her. He was waiting. Jeremiah stared, clutching his wrist, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, pain, fury, and a dawning, utter confusion. The world as he knew it had been upended. His daughter was supposed to be weak. His mule was supposed to be docile. The order of his universe, an order he enforced with cruelty and conviction, had just been torn apart by the 2 most subservient creatures on his farm. "Get away from him, Magnolia," he ordered, his voice strained. "Get back to work. I'll deal with this beast." He gestured with his head toward the fallen rifle, a clear threat. This was the moment. The old Magnolia would have scrambled to obey, terrified of the consequences. The old Magnolia would have tried to placate him, to calm the situation, to accept the blame. But the girl rising from the dust was not the old Magnolia. She was someone new, someone forged in the fire of a mule's courage. She pushed herself to her feet. She was unsteady, swaying slightly in the oppressive heat, but she was standing. She put a hand on Buster's broad, dusty flank, a gesture of solidarity, of alliance. The mule's muscles were rigid, but he allowed the touch. He didn't flinch. No. The word was quiet. It was small, rusty from disuse and cracked with dehydration, but in the vast, ringing silence of the Texas morning, it landed with the force of a gunshot. Jeremiah stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He had not heard that word from her, directed at him, in 2 years. Not since her mother died. He finally found his voice, sputtering with disbelief. What? What did you say? Magnolia took a breath, drawing strength from the solid warmth of the animal beside her. She looked her father directly in the eye, something she hadn't dared to do for months. His narrowed gaze, which had always made her shrink, now seemed smaller, less powerful. I said, she repeated, her voice gaining a fraction more strength, a tremor of righteous anger starting to burn through the fear. No. She took a small step forward, moving from behind Buster's protection to stand beside him, a partner in this strange rebellion. No more. I'm not doing it anymore. You ungrateful little... He took a menacing step toward her, his good hand clenching into a fist. Buster immediately lowered his head, a silent warning, and Jeremiah froze. He was trapped between his defiant daughter and the animal that had already proven it would not hesitate to harm him. The balance of power had shifted so completely it was almost dizzying. Ungrateful? The word ignited the kindling of Magnolia's defiance into a blazing fire. Years of swallowed pain, of silent tears and hidden bruises rushed to the surface. You think I should be grateful for this? Her voice rose, gaining volume and clarity with every word, a torrent unleashed. Grateful for being worked like an animal from sunup to sundown? Grateful for the strap you keep on your belt? Grateful for going to bed hungry because I was too slow, too tired, too weak for you? She gestured around at the desolate, sun-scorched field. You call this building character, Daddy? You call this making me strong? Look at me! She held out her hands, showing him the raw blisters, the cracked nails, the ingrained dirt. Look at what you've done. You're not building anything. You're just breaking what's left. Each word was a stone she threw at him, chipping away at the fortress of his self-righteousness. He flinched, not from a physical blow, but from the truth in her voice. You don't know what you're talking about, he snarled. But the conviction was gone. It was a hollow echo of his usual tyranny. This world is hard. It'll eat you alive if you're not harder. I'm teaching you what you need to survive. Survive? She cried, a raw, incredulous laugh escaping her throat. This isn't surviving. This is a slow death. You know who taught me how to survive? Mama did. She taught me to be kind. She taught me to find beauty in the little things, in the one bluebonnet that managed to grow by the porch step. She taught me that strength wasn't about being hard. It was about being able to get back up after you'd been knocked down. Magnolia's voice broke on the last words, the grief she had been forced to bury alongside her mother finally breaking free. Don't you bring your mother into this, he warned, his voice dangerously low. You're not fit to speak her name. I'm not fit? The accusation was so profoundly unjust, it burned away the last of her fear, leaving only a white-hot, clarifying rage. I'm the one who remembers her. I'm the one who remembers the songs she sang and the stories she told. What do you remember, Daddy? Do you even remember her smile? Or have you replaced it with the memory of this? She pointed a trembling finger at the leather strap lying in the dust. Is that your love for her now? Is this cruelty the only memorial you can build? The direct hit landed. She saw it in the way his face crumpled, the way his eyes widened with a flicker of horrified recognition before the anger slammed back down like a shield. He was looking at her, but for a split second, she knew he was seeing his wife, Alara. He was hearing a faint echo of the woman he had lost, the woman he claimed to be honoring with this brutal regime. The verbal battle had stripped away the pretense. This wasn't about building character or surviving in a hard world. It was about his pain. It was about the gaping wound his wife's death had left in him, a wound he was trying to cauterize by inflicting pain on the only person he had left. He was a man drowning in his own unprocessed grief, and he was trying to pull her under with him. "I'm done," Magnolia said, her voice now steady, imbued with the terrible calm that follows a storm. "I'm done being your whipping post. I'm done being the stand-in for your ghosts. You want to work this field? You work it. You want to honor Mama's memory? Then you can start by remembering the man she married, not the monster you've become." She turned her back on him then, a gesture of finality more powerful than any shout. She walked over to the water barrel by the oak tree, her movements still tired but no longer defeated. They were deliberate. She scooped up a dipper of water, her hand shaking, and drank deeply. It was the best water she had ever tasted. It tasted like freedom. Then she refilled the dipper and walked back to Buster, holding it out for him. The old mule drank, his soft, whiskered lips tickling her palm. He had earned it. He had earned everything. Jeremiah stood frozen, his world utterly dismantled. His authority was gone, his weapons lay in the dust, his justifications had been exposed as hollow lies. He was just a man with a broken wrist and a broken heart, being stared down by his own daughter. The sun beat down on him, but for the first time, he seemed to feel its heat not as a catalyst for work, but as a punishing, unbearable weight. The midpoint had been reached. A no had been spoken, and in the silence that followed, a far more devastating battle was about to begin. The confrontation had escalated from a physical standoff to a raw verbal battle, and now the air was thick with the unspoken truths that still lay buried, waiting to be unearthed. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. Jeremiah's face was a canvas of warring emotions. The rage was still there, a sullen fire in his eyes, but it was banked now, overshadowed by a profound, disoriented shock. He looked from Magnolia to the mule, then to the rifle in the dirt, as if trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered authority. He was a king deposed, left standing in the ruins of his tiny, tyrannical kingdom. "You think you're so smart," he finally rasped. The words scraped raw from his throat. He was talking to her, but his eyes were on the horizon, as if searching for a script, for a line that would restore the old order. "You think you can just say no? That's not how the world works. You think this changes anything? Tomorrow morning the sun will come up, and this field will still need plowing. The well will still be low. There's only work. There's only the dirt." Magnolia finished giving Buster water and set the dipper down with a soft click. She turned to face him fully, her stance rooted, her chin high. The girl who had collapsed in a heap of exhaustion was gone, replaced by this stony-eyed young woman who looked at him not with fear, but with a weary, terrible clarity. "The dirt doesn't ask for anything back," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "It just is. You're the one who asks. You're the one who takes and takes and takes." "I gave you everything," he exploded, the anger flaring again, a desperate defensive reflex. "A roof over your head, food on your plate. Everything I have is for you." "Is it?" she challenged, her voice dangerously soft. "Or is it for you? Is it so you don't have to be alone with your memories? Is it so you have someone to punish because she's not here anymore?" The name went unspoken, but it hung between them, heavy and shimmering as the heat haze. "Alara. Mama." "You stop it," he warned, taking a half-step forward before Buster shifted his weight, a subtle, effective check. Jeremiah's good hand clenched and unclenched. "You don't know the first thing about it. You don't know what it is to lose everything that matters. You were just a child." "I wasn't a child when I held her hand while she was dying," Magnolia shot back, and the words sliced through the air, sharp and glittering as shattered glass. I was old enough to watch the light go out of her eyes. I was old enough to hear what she said. A new kind of stillness fell over Jeremiah. The anger in his face receded, replaced by a dawning dread. He had his own version of that story, a version he had polished through repetition until it shone with the dull gleam of accepted fact. A swift fever, a merciful end, a tragedy that demanded strength and hard work in its wake. He had built his entire post-Alara world on that foundation. Now, he watched his daughter, and he saw a tremor in her chin, a darkness in her eyes that told him she was about to take a hammer to that foundation. She was delirious, he stammered, his voice losing its timbre. The fever. There was a fever, Magnolia conceded, her gaze unwavering. But that's not what killed her, Daddy, and you know it. You just won't admit it. What are you talking about? He demanded, but his voice was thin, pleading. He was begging her not to say it, not to give voice to the secret ugly thing he had kept locked away in the deepest cellar of his mind. But she had been pushed too far. He had called her weak, ungrateful. He had threatened her, and the only creature who had shown her kindness. He had twisted the memory of her mother into a justification for cruelty. He had left her no choice. The truth was, the only weapon she had left, and it was time to use it. Mama didn't die of a fever, Magnolia said, and her voice dropped, becoming an incantation of grief and judgment. She died of this. She swept her arm out, a gesture that encompassed the sun, the field, the plow, the house, him. She died of exhaustion. She died from working herself into the grave, trying to keep this worthless patch of dirt afloat while you were lost in a bottle, mourning yourself. She worked from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. She mended the fences, she tended the garden, she hauled the water, and she held this family together with nothing but her own 2 hands and a broken heart. Jeremiah was shaking his head, a frantic, rhythmic denial. No, that's not true. She was sick. She was sick of being tired. Magnolia's voice cracked, tears finally streaming down her face, hot on her dusty cheeks. They were not tears of weakness, but of rage. She was sick of watching you drink yourself numb every night. The fever was just the last straw. It was what happens when a body has nothing left to give. It was the same thing that just happened to me, out here in this field. Don't you see? She stepped closer, invading his space, forcing him to look at her, to see the truth in her tear-streaked face. I collapsed. My body just quit. That's what happened to her. She collapsed by the woodpile, and you were too drunk to notice for an hour. By the time you found her, it was too late. The fever had taken hold because she was too worn down to fight it. She died because you worked her to death. The words landed in the silence, and the silence shattered. The truth, ugly and undeniable, was finally out, crawling in the dust between them. Jeremiah stared at her, his face ashen, his mouth agape. The carefully constructed narrative of his grief, the story that allowed him to be the tragic victim and the righteous taskmaster, had been utterly annihilated. He was not the noble survivor of a tragedy. He was its cause. He staggered back, tripping over a rock and landing hard on the ground. The fall mirrored Magnolia's own collapse, but where hers was from exhaustion, his was from the crushing weight of revelation. He sat there in the dirt, looking up at his daughter, his eyes wide with a horror that was directed entirely inward. He was finally seeing himself. Not the grieving husband, not the strict father. He was seeing the monster she had named. But Magnolia wasn't finished. She had one last stone to throw, the one that would bring the whole rotten structure down for good. "And do you know the last thing she said to me?" she whispered, kneeling down so she was at his level, forcing him to meet her gaze. The fever wasn't all she had. She had a moment, a clear moment. She pulled me close and she whispered in my ear. She paused, letting the silence stretch, letting him dread the final blow. She told me, "Maggie, this place will kill you too. Your father's grief, it's a poison, and he's pouring it in your cup every day. Don't you drink it. Promise me you'll run. Promise me you'll get away from here and live. Don't let him do to you what he did to me." Magnolia's voice was a ragged whisper now, thick with unshed oceans of grief. Her dying wish was for me to escape you. That was it. That was the killing blow. It wasn't just that he was responsible for his wife's death. It was that Ilara had known. She had seen the man he was becoming, and her last act on this earth was to try and save her daughter from him. The love he claimed to be honoring was a love that saw him as a threat, a danger, a poison. A sound tore from Jeremiah's throat, a strangled, inhuman noise that was part sob, part howl of agony. It was the sound of a man's soul breaking apart. He scrambled away from her, crawling backward in the dirt like a frightened crab, his eyes wild with self-loathing. He finally came to rest against the trunk of the oak tree, the very place where he had stood in judgment minutes before. He slumped against it, his head in his good hand, his body racked with violent, silent shudders. He was brought low. He was on the ground, in the dirt that represented his pride and his cruelty, shattered by the truth. Magnolia stood, looking down at the wreck of her father. There was no triumph in her, only a vast, aching emptiness. She had won. She had spoken her truth. But the victory felt like another kind of wound. The climax was over. The secret was out. And in the devastating emotional catharsis that followed, there was nothing left but the pieces of two broken people on a forgotten patch of Texas land, with a silent, watchful mule standing guard over the wreckage. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The oppressive heat of midday softened into the gentler, though no less weary warmth of evening. For a long time, nothing moved. The tableau remained frozen, the weeping man slumped against the tree, the exhausted girl standing over him, and the patient mule, a dusty statue of silent justice. The echoes of Magnolia's revelation seemed to have been absorbed by the parched earth, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done. Finally, the shuddering that racked Jeremiah's body subsided into a deep, hollow stillness. He didn't look up. He seemed to be staring at his own hands, one of them swelling and useless, the other covered in the same dirt that caked his daughter's face. He seemed to be seeing them for the first time, not as tools of labor or instruments of punishment, but as the hands of a man who had destroyed everything he ever meant to protect. Magnolia watched him. The fire of her anger now cooled to embers of a deep, sorrowful ache. Seeing him so completely broken gave her no satisfaction. This shrunken, weeping man was a stranger, as much as the cruel tyrant had been. Both were pale imitations of the father she dimly remembered, the one who smelled of sawdust and sunshine, the one who had taught her how to whistle. The loss of that man felt like a fresh grief, layered on top of all the others. Without a word, she turned and walked back to the water barrel. Her movements were slow, aching. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. She filled the dipper again. She hesitated for a moment, her own thirst a pressing need. But then she walked over to her father. She stood before him for a moment, and when he didn't move or look up, she knelt in the dirt, just as she had before. She held out the dipper. "Drink," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger or pity. It was just a statement of fact. Water was needed. Jeremiah flinched as if the simple word were a blow. He slowly raised his head, and she saw his face, stripped bare of all its masks. It was ravaged. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his cheeks tracked with clean streaks where tears had washed away the grime. He looked old. He looked defeated. He stared at the dipper of water as if it were a chalice of poison. He shook his head, a small, jerky movement. "I don't deserve it." "Probably not," Magnolia agreed, her voice still level. "But you'll die without it. Drink the water." Her insistence was not an act of forgiveness. It was something more fundamental, more primal. It was a refusal to let him die, a refusal to become him. She would not let him perish from neglect in the field, just as her mother had. To do so would be to accept his own cruel logic, and she had fought too hard today to surrender to that. He stared at her, at the unwavering resolve in her young old eyes, and seemed to understand. He was not being offered grace. He was being given a command by a new and unfamiliar authority. Slowly, with his good hand trembling, he reached out and took the dipper. He drank, his throat working convulsively. Some of the water spilled down his chin, soaking the front of his shirt, but he drained the vessel completely. He handed the empty dipper back to her. Their fingers brushed, and they both recoiled slightly from the contact. The space between them was charged with 2 years of pain and a lifetime of unspoken things. "Maggie, he began, his voice a broken croak. "I didn't. I never." He couldn't form the words. Apology, justification, explanation, all of them were dust in his mouth. "Don't," she said, cutting him off. She stood up, turning her back on him again. Forgiveness was not on the table. It was a country she couldn't even see from here. The sun's going down. The work's not done. She walked to Buster, unhitching him from the useless plow. She patted the mule's strong neck, her fingers sinking into his coarse, dusty coat. "Good boy, Buster," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a good boy." The mule nudged her shoulder with his head, a gesture of quiet comfort. Leading him by the halter, she began the slow walk back toward the barn, not looking back to see if her father was following. She could hear him, though, the sound of a man struggling to his feet, the crunch of his boots on the hard earth, hesitant and shuffling, as he fell into step a dozen paces behind her. The familiar evening chores were performed in a heavy, suffocating silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the oppressive silence of dread, but the awkward, fragile silence of a truce. Magnolia fed the chickens and gathered the few meager eggs. Jeremiah, using his one good hand, clumsily forked hay into Buster's manger, his movements stiff and uncertain. He looked like a guest in his own barn, a stranger fumbling with unfamiliar tasks. When they entered the small, dark kitchen of the farmhouse, the tension thickened. This was the heart of the home, the room that had once been filled with the scent of her mother's baking and the sound of her laughter. Now, it was just a space they shared, haunted by her absence. Magnolia moved to the stove, her body acting on instinct, her mind 1,000 miles away. She was about to start the usual meager meal of beans and stale bread when Jeremiah spoke, his voice startlingly close behind her. "Sit down." She turned, her body tensing automatically, preparing for an order, for a fight. But his expression held no command. It was a plea. "Please," he added, the word sounding foreign and painful on his tongue. "Sit down, Magnolia. Let me." She stared at him, confused. He gestured with his head toward the small kitchen table. He moved past her to the stove, and with a slowness that was agonizing to watch, he began to prepare a meal. He struggled, his broken wrist making every action a clumsy battle. He couldn't open a can with one hand, couldn't chop an onion effectively, couldn't lift the heavy iron skillet. Yet he persisted. He didn't ask for help. He just worked, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements punctuated by soft grunts of pain and frustration. Magnolia sank into a chair at the table, watching him. It was the most surreal moment of her life. Her father, the taskmaster, was cooking for her. It was a small act, a clumsy one, but it was an act of service. It was an acknowledgement of his failure, an apology written in the fumbling language of action, because words had failed him. He was trying to change, to prove himself, to begin the slow, arduous process of rebuilding not just trust, but his very self. He was taking the first, painful, deliberate step. He eventually placed a plate in front of her. It was a mess, burnt potatoes and half-cooked bacon, but it was the first meal he had ever cooked for her. He sat opposite her, not eating, just watching her with those haunted, broken eyes. She picked up her fork. She took a bite. It tasted of smoke and remorse. They ate in silence, When the meal was over, he stood and cleared the plates, another clumsy, one-handed operation. Magnolia went out onto the front porch and sat on the top step, wrapping her arms around her knees. The sky was now a deep, velvety indigo, pricked with the first sharp diamonds of starlight. The air was finally cooling, carrying the scent of dust and distant sleeping fields. A few minutes later, the screen door creaked open and shut. Jeremiah came out onto the porch, and after a long moment of hesitation, sat on the other end of the top step, leaving a wide gulf of space between them. He didn't speak. He just sat, looking out at the same dark expanse she was. The silence was different again. It was no longer awkward or heavy. It was quiet. It was a shared space, a fragile peace treaty signed without words. Forgiveness had not been given, nor had it been truly asked for. An apology had not been accepted. But something had begun. A door that had been slammed shut and bolted 2 years ago had been cracked open, just a sliver. He cleared his throat, and she tensed, but he didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the stars. "That bluebonnet," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "The one by the step. I remember it. Your mother, she loved that flower. Said it was stubborn, just like her." Magnolia didn't answer. She just pulled her knees a little tighter to her chest. A single tear traced a slow path down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't for the pain that had been. It was for the fragile, tentative peace that was, for the long and uncertain road ahead. The sun had set. The brutal heat of the day was over. In the quiet cool of the Texas night, a father and a daughter sat on a porch, separated by a chasm of pain but sharing the same sky. It was not a happy ending. It was not forgiveness. It was just a beginning, a quiet, shared moment of hope, a silent promise that home and love were not things that were given, but things that could, perhaps, be rebuilt, one splinter and one scar at a time.